So this evening, we're going to be talking about dynamics of race and cultural appropriation, and we're looking at it specifically through the lens of yoga. And I just wanted to share with you before we set off some of my key principles, because it helps you to kind of locate where my thinking is and where my position is. I'm a South Asian heritage. I'm from the north of India, from a region called the Punjab. My family faith system is Sikhism and Hinduism, and I've been practicing yoga. And when I'm talking yoga, I'm talking beyond yoga asana, the whole system of yoga, for as long as I can remember. And I've been a qualified yoga teacher for about 3 years. And my key principles that guide me are a commitment to anti-racism, social justice, and collective liberation. So my lens of looking at yoga is as individual liberation, moksha, but also that is part of collective liberation. My belief is that as an individual, I cannot be liberated and have consciousness and awareness of consciousness without those around me being similarly able to access that liberation and consciousness. I invite you to move to a place of vulnerability during these conversations. Inevitably, we will begin to feel defensive, or we will have some race trauma that may be triggered by some of these conversations. So I invite you all to be in a heart-centered place of compassion and deep listening. I'm going to center Black and Brown voices. So if there are Black and Brown voices who wish to be heard today, please make sure that you have an opportunity to speak by requesting so through chat or unmuting yourself. And I invite us all to be accountable for our own individual roles and taking responsibility for what we can do in order to effect sustainable social change and bring about race equity. So our accountability to others is the purpose of this conversation and the value that sits behind the Yoga Teachers Union. And for me, yoga is a practice of social justice and activism. So my dharma, my life purpose, my noble purpose is to effect social change where I see barriers and injustice. And I believe that is the pathway to moksha or liberation and samadhi consciousness. And so for me, this quote here, I wish to share with you because it resonates deeply with me. And I invite you to bring this awareness to your practice also. A spirituality that is only private and self-absorbed, one devoid of an authentic political and social consciousness, does little to halt the suicidal juggernaut of history. And I'm going to come to that because we're going to touch upon the legacy of colonialism and how that's present in the practice of yoga today in the West. On the other hand, an activism that is not purified by profound spiritual and psychological self-awareness and rooted in divine truth, wisdom, and compassion will only perpetuate the problem it is trying to solve, however righteous its intention. So here we're going to distinguish between intention and impact, and be mindful that our impact, no matter what our intentions may be, our impact in issues of race is the most significant factor to consider. When, however, the deepest and most grounded spiritual vision is married to a practical, pragmatic drive to transform all existing institutions, a holy force, the power of wisdom and love in action is born. This force I define as sacred activism. This is a quote from the book The Hope by Andrew Harvey. So for me, our practice of yoga is an act of revolutionary love. And in that way, we begin to effect social change and bring about justice where we can, in partnership and in collaboration with each other. And then when prejudice and power come together, it results in oppression. there will be the systemic subjugation of those people against whom prejudice, bigoted prejudice, is expressed and held. And when that comes together with power, then it has the ability to impact and reduce the life opportunities of those people in the oppressed group. And the oppression might be evident in terms of unemployment, glass ceilings, inherited wealth, being disenfranchised from the vote, being excluded from decision-making, leadership roles, from having low social status, from being considered to be a subculture rather than a cultural norm. All of these things come together to create a system of racism. So racism aren't individual acts. Individual acts are prejudice, are bigoted prejudice. But when prejudice comes together with power, that is a systemic racism. And this is where conflict arises in terms of our understanding of what racism is. On the whole, racism is defined as interpersonal acts, individual acts of racism between individuals, where there may be microaggression. That's how we understand racism. But racism is operating at an institutional level, where policies and practices that reinforce certain standards within a workspace or an organization, such as yoga studios. And when different institutions come together, then we have what we call structural racism, which is where multiple institutions collectively uphold and maintain racist policies and practices. And when we talk about racism, we are talking about practices and policies that impact on and cause oppression for specific groups that can be identified by their characteristics. And then sitting underneath this is internalized racism. And this is the cultural hegemony of whiteness and the superiority that is understood, and we'll come into how that has been seeded and planted, is that we all ingest and inhale covert and subtle messages about race and negative beliefs based on race. Those who are considered to be more superior and those who are considered to be less superior or inferior. If we as a culture don't reckon with our history, then we will repeat patterns of oppression and create more harm than good. So it's absolutely fundamental that we look at how yoga has arrived in the West. What is the journey of yoga to the West? And I'm not going to cover all of this because this is a very short talk. I do a 10-hour course on this, which we explore this in more detail. So forgive me for generalizing and not giving as much detailed information as you would normally get. So colonialism, and to define colonialism is the control by conquest, subjugation, and exploitation by one powerful nation over a dependent land or people, while imposing own language and cultural values as the dominant norm. If you were to extrapolate that and what that means in the industry as a whole, that's a real indictment on the yoga industry. And then layer upon that the lack of pathways or support in which to be able to raise issues of racial discrimination or acts of racial harm that you've witnessed, and how do you begin to restitute and begin to repair that harm that is being created and caused in yoga spaces. So that's very revealing and reveals the extent of the issue in our industry. And I know that I've discussed this with Norman previously, that yoga is one of the spaces where I've experienced the most number of acts of racial harm compared to some other spheres, because there's the least regulation in some ways. And so the lack of regulation, the lack of representation, the lack of shared power, shared decision-making in these spaces means that these practices are perpetuated. So those people who have the power and the resource to own and create yoga spaces are able to perpetuate their own cultural norms within those spaces without adjusting their behavior. So there's a cultural dominance and hegemony in yoga spaces in a practice that is actually rooted in South Asia. So we have a colonized practice in spaces where there's cultural hegemony of whiteness. And that to me is a very harmful space for yoga to be in. And therefore this call for action to us to begin to challenge and change this is where I'm really drawing upon the work that I do and the work that the Yoga Teachers Union will be called to do. And before I move on to the next section, and I'm going to invite you to think about, as we move through the next section, using your yogic philosophy. So this is for the kleshas. So Patanjali's understanding of the kleshas, the roots of the pancha kleshas, the roots of suffering. And if you go to Pada 2, section 3, Sutra 3, so, you'll find it there. Avidya, Asmita, Raga, Devesha, Abhinivesha, Panchaklesha, that sutra. And the reason I'm inviting you to reflect on this teaching that you acquired in your 200 hours YTT is that the root causes of suffering, dukkha, are afflictions, are conditioned beliefs and behaviors that we have all been subject to. So we've all been conditioned and socialized. None of us are exceptional. We've all been shaped by history. We've all been shaped by the culture in which we live. And some of these ways, some of the thoughts that we've acquired, the vrittis, you know, the yoga chitta vritti nirodha, the calming of those thoughts that we have, some of these thoughts are invalid or inaccurate. And some of them are valid and accurate. But who gets to decide which of those thoughts are valid and accurate? So these are our perceptions, our lenses. So we have pramana and we have viparya. Viparya are inaccurate perceptions and pramana are accurate perceptions. So what we want to do is we want to release this filter that we see these issues of race through. So if we are shaped by whiteness and the cultural dominance, that is the lens that we bring to it. How do we unveil and release those filters? And I'd like to invite you to think about those filters, those conditioned patterns of thinking as kleshas, as the root causes of suffering in yoga and in our society.